What if I told you that one of the most important protections in your life is something that you've probably never paid attention to or spent even 5 seconds thinking about?
Pay attention.
I'm talking about warrants. They sound legal, procedural. People think warrants are just about paperwork, but they're not. Warrants are one of the most important checks on power ever invented. And there's a certain part of the warrant that almost no one ever talks about, even though it's the part that matters most. So in this video, we're going to shine a light on this hidden ingredient that makes warrants so essential to freedom. We'll explore what warrants are, why the founders cared so much about them, and why they matter more now than ever in an age where governments are buying all your data from brokers, contracting with private companies to track your movements, and bulk collecting all your financial records. It's a new digital era, and the protections that warrants were meant to provide have been all but eradicated. So stick with me, because once you understand the machinery inside a warrant, you'll never dismiss the importance of them again. Let's start by understanding what a warrant actually is. Warrants have existed in legal systems around the world for a long time. They're basically a permission slip for the government to search your stuff, seize property, or arrest someone. They vary enormously, country from country, in how broad they are. In America, for example, they're meant to be particularly limited, and these strict limits were actually explicitly written into the Constitution itself. This is because at the time that the Constitution was written, Britain and colonial America had been badly abusing warrants.
One of the big reasons for the American Revolution was the British use of general warrants.
Rob Fromer is the co-director of the Fourth Amendment Project at the Institute for Justice, and he explained to me how general warrants and writs of assistance were two types of broad search powers that officials were using in the early colonial days to rummage through a person's home and things with very little constraint.
There are these pieces of paper that officers, officials, would basically write to themselves, and that would give them power to just enter people's homes, enter people's property, invade them whenever they wanted.
I have a permit.
This just says I can do what I want.
And they would just carry that in their pocket. And that let those petty officers be a law unto themselves, where they could break in anywhere they wanted to at any time without any real justification.
They became a powerful tool for harassment and abuse.
They were using them to suppress dissent. People who would criticize the crown, criticize officials in the British government, those officials would use their general warrant powers to break into people's houses, to rummage through their papers in order to try to find seditious materials. That's one of the big reasons we had a revolution.
So when the founders were writing America's Constitution, to stop this kind of abuse from happening again, they decided that warrants had to be tightly limited in scope.
They wanted to prevent ever having that kind of arbitrary power given to officers to invade our security and our persons and property.
So they drafted the Fourth Amendment, and this is what it said. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
The Fourth Amendment was added to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to protect against general warrants.
Jim Harper is a constitutional law scholar who specializes in the Fourth Amendment and how it applies in the digital age. And he explained to me what this new, narrowly scoped warrant requirement actually involves.
The two major elements of a warrant is having probable cause, that is a strong belief that evidence or fruits of crime can be found. And the other is particularity. So a warrant has to state with particularity the places to be searched and the things to be seized.
That narrowness mattered because it meant that those in power could no longer go on fishing expeditions, searching your things until they found something that they could use against you. It helped protect against abuse. It also created accountability because it left a record. Abuse is much harder to challenge when there's no paper trail and no one ever had to justify themselves in the first place. But let's zoom in on one of the most overlooked parts of the warrant requirement, which most people never talk about. The fact that an investigator had to make their case in front of a judge and prove that they had probable cause before the search was allowed to happen.
The founders, for some reason, thought they should bring in a second branch of government to arbitrate this. Can you explain, why they thought that was necessary?
It's crucially important. The reason the framers had this idea of bringing in that second branch, bringing in the judiciary, is because you don't want government agents to be running off their own say-so. The government has unique power to break into our homes, arrest us, sometimes even kill us. You want an independent, neutral branch looking at those decisions before they happened, before they invade, to decide whether there's enough facts to actually justify it.
We're so used to treating law enforcement as the highest authority for keeping law and order that we forget that the Constitution treated it as just one power center amongst others, and one that needed limits. Those who wrote the Constitution understood that law enforcement has its own mission, its own incentives, its own momentum. It's trying to solve the case, close the loop, find the culprit. That doesn't make investigators evil, but it does mean that they're not neutral. And once you realize that, the warrant requirement no longer seems like bureaucratic paperwork. You understand that they're a very deliberate safeguard against the natural bias of the investigative process. In fact, in 1948, the Supreme Court put it bluntly when they said,
"We don't want to leave this to the officer who's engaged in what they call the competitive enterprise of ferreting out crime."
Instead, said the Supreme Court, the Fourth Amendment requires that judgments about whether there is probable cause for a warrant to be made by a neutral and detached magistrate. They understood that the officers themselves are not neutral.
They're really eager, right? Because if they make a big bust, that's great for their career. So they're gung-ho. And we want somebody in the middle to just be like, wait a second, show me your homework. Show me that you actually have a good reason to do this, and not just because you're seeing promotions and awards in your eyes.
The people who wrote the Constitution didn't assume that the same people trying to solve the case should also be trusted to decide on their own how far they get to pry into someone's life. They assumed the opposite, that the drive to solve a case could itself become dangerous if no outside check stood in the way.
When executive officials get to be a law unto themselves and they get to make these decisions with no independent check, abuses amount.
So, the neutral magistrate authorizing the search in advance is essential.
And what we've seen is that when that is ignored, those bad things tend to happen more and more.
That is why the executive and judicial branches have different jobs. The executive branch is in the business of investigating crime. The judicial branch is meant to stand back from the momentum of investigation and make sure that the government does not get to decide the limits of its own power. That separation is intentional.
The judiciary is supposed to be there as the bulwark of our rights.
But today, the judiciary is conspicuously absent from signing off on a huge number of searches that are going on. Investigators are buying giant data sets from brokers and searching this data at will. Unfettered access to troves of personal data about our lives with no magistrate involved. Now let's pause here and answer the obvious question. What is so dangerous about these searches that we built constitutional limits around them in the first place? Well, the real issue is not just the search itself. It's the power that comes from what the search reveals. Information is power, and the Fourth Amendment was designed to limit the government's access to information about you, to limit the amount of power that it had over you, and to make sure that power did not turn into abuse. If a government can look through your life in enough detail, it can always find something that can be made to look suspicious, something that could be distorted, or something that it can use as leverage. As the old Soviet saying goes, show me the man and I'll show you the crime. The warning is simple. Once the government gets enough access to the fragments of your life, those fragments become easy to rearrange into a narrative.
You can take any information from anybody, and if you have enough of it, you can cobble together that story about like why they're a bad actor and they should be gone after.
You were near the wrong place. You searched for the wrong thing. You texted the wrong joke. You donated to the wrong cause. Maybe you used encryption, turned off your phone, showed up in someone's contact list. None of that has to mean guilt. But modern life produces so much data that innocence alone can no longer protect you. If officials decide in advance whom they want to target, and they have access to a giant trove of someone's life, they can often easily find scraps of evidence to fit the narrative.
With vast amounts of information out there subject to official inquiry, including very personal stuff about my movements, where I bank, my medical conditions, things like that, there's a huge concern that officials will misuse that to go after the person rather than the crime.
Now again, this does not require evil motives. It can happen simply because investigators are doing what investigators do, trying to connect dots. But once someone is looking for a culprit, the temptation is to treat scattered clues as if they all point in one direction. Out of context fragments of your life start to look suspicious because they're being viewed through the lens of suspicion by someone trained to do just that. And now we're increasingly outsourcing that process to AI, again, with no magistrate involved. When we let masses of data generate their own story, innocent people get swept up in the dragnet. Data is not benign. It can always be sorted, weighted, and interpreted in ways that make ordinary life look incriminating.
We see officers, when they are engaged in law enforcement activities, they'll often get an idea in their head, like, this is what happened. And then instead of trying to do a neutral investigation in order to determine what objectively happened, they start backfilling, start taking facts and trying to contort them to fit their pre-existing narrative. And that's exactly why you want to have that neutral judge in the middle, because if you don't, there's no independent check, and the dogs will run wild.
Now, so far, we've been talking about how this power can become dangerous even in the hands of people who think that they're doing the right thing. But once the machinery exists, it doesn't stay confined to good faith mistakes. It becomes available to people with worse motives. And the elephant in the room is that the more data someone has access to, the more power they have. Feed these systems enough data and they gain a greater ability to sort people, rank people, and decide who gets more scrutiny. This is how discretionary targeting begins. It can identify whistleblowers. It can chill journalists. It can map protest networks before they become effective. It can scare ordinary people away from joining, donating, speaking, meeting, or pushing back against the people in charge. Now, maybe the government never actually decides to do these things. But once the infrastructure is there, it's a huge temptation. You're basically hoping that no one ever gets into office who might abuse this power. And if they do, they now have a ready-made system for intimidating dissidents, finding leverage over political opponents, and entrenching their own power.
Having a government that the wheels come off of and our protections fall away, well, we're going to really need our privacy then. It's why we have these protections, is to protect our democratic institutions.
Well, that's why we're meant to have these protections. But today, it's almost like we've forgotten about the Fourth Amendment. And this is a huge mistake. Not only are these protections set up by the founders still relevant, they're actually more important than ever, because today's government can access a staggering flood of information compared to anything the founders could have ever imagined. Every part of our life is digitally archived in data logs, telemetry, search history, prompt archives, location records, and maps of your social graph. Your data has already been collected by myriad companies archiving every aspect of your life. Your bank has your transactions. Your phone company has your location. Your email provider stores your messages. Your cloud account holds your files. Your apps know where you go, what you search, what you buy, who you talk to, and what patterns your life follows.
But we have multi-billion-dollar industries that have popped up to surveil us.
And it turns out that all of this data is completely up for grabs, with no judge getting in the way.
Do you think that currently law enforcement are getting warrants as often as they should when they're conducting searches?
Oh no, not at all. There's a huge amount of investigative activity that should require a warrant that doesn't get it.
How is this possible? Well, many agencies act as if a warrant is just the key that forces someone to hand over data. And if they don't need the key, if they can just buy that data instead, why bother with the warrant? But that misses the deeper point. The Fourth Amendment is about searches. No unreasonable searches. Government should need to get a warrant to search data about us, regardless of how they got that data.
There's a lot of investigation and a lot of things that happen without it ever being called a search, and it's happening on the officer's own say-so.
I declare that if I make my own government database filled with everyone's information and search it, it's no longer considered a search. Huh. Yeah, that's quite good. Huh, that'll do.
In 2023, your predecessor testified that, and I quote, "To my knowledge, we do not currently purchase commercial database information that includes location data derived from internet advertising." Is that the case still? And if so, can you commit this morning to not buying Americans' location data?
The FBI uses all tools, Senator, thank you for the question, to do our mission. We do purchase commercially available information that's consistent with the Constitution and the laws under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act.
Oh boy.
They're rummaging your things. They just have to be digital things that are held remotely for you. And that's one of the things that I think the court should recognize.
I know people have had their medical records subpoenaed, and I'm thinking, why couldn't you have gone to a judge? If you have such a case against this person, why can't you go to a judge and get a warrant? And you know what the dirty secret is? The vast majority of times, if the government went and applied for a warrant, they'd probably get it. They just view it as a busy work, and they don't want to do it. I was actually talking with some family members who are federal employees. I'm like, why can't you go get a warrant? And he's saying, oh, it'd be easy to do because we have all this evidence against them. Like, well, why don't you want to do it? Oh, because it's a pain. He just wants to go. And I just want some judge in the middle to be like, whoa, what? Just wait a second. Just show me why first.
Warrant applications involve some work. Maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 45 minutes. If you're good at it, it's half an hour. It requires them to think carefully about their cases and articulate their cases. But there's an ongoing tension. The government side is constantly pushing to lower the warrant requirement. They really do want to catch criminals, but I think they want to make it so easy that the processes that don't go through the warrant requirement are subject to abuse. And obviously with the huge swelling of information that's online in third-party hands, our privacy is undermined deeply by the resistance to using warrants to get information when they properly should.
The idea that my location information, all the routes I've driven, all the places I've gone, is sitting in a government database that any officer can look up whenever they want, just for, just idle curiosity, that undermines my security.
And that's exactly the problem. The whole point of the warrant requirement is to slow investigators down, force them to justify themselves, and put a judge in the middle before the search happens. Do we really want to regress back to that time of abuse before those safeguards by pretending that there's this whole category of activities like database queries that somehow falls outside the definition of a search?
The word search, there's nothing magical about it. It just means any purposeful investigative act. And more importantly, it meant the exact same thing back in 1789 when they were enacting the Fourth Amendment. So a search is any purposeful investigative act by the government. The government buying your data so they can look at it is a purposeful investigative act.
If the government wants to do a search on someone, whether it's in their own database or someone else's, they should need to get a warrant to access that information.
We want that friction.
It might be time for legislature to step in because this is getting out of control.
Just like I asked the courts to be the intermediary between us and the state with regards to warrants, the legislature should be an intermediary between us and the surveillance state.
There are some interesting laws being floated right now. One is the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, which would stop the government buying data from brokers. Another is the Government Surveillance Reform Act, which would also stop the government's purchase of data and would reform Section 702 of FISA. And there's the Surveillance Accountability Act, which would clarify that if the government wants to do a search on someone, it needs a warrant. And if they skirt this requirement, they should be held accountable. If you want more information on any of these and how you can participate, I've put links in the video description. Enough is enough. We need to re-establish protections in the digital age. If nothing else, we need to have a serious conversation as a society about whether we're willing to accept this new normal and whether we want every future regime that comes to power to be able to search giant databases about all of us at will. We're constantly told that we need to balance law enforcement's need for data with our rights, but
the Fourth Amendment is the balance. The Fourth Amendment was the design of the framers to say, no, there's certain things the government can't do without judicial approval.
We already know what the balance is. We just have to go back to enforcing it. A warrant isn't boring paperwork or something that just makes life harder for law enforcement. It is one of the most important protections that we have. It's the rule that says that those with the most power don't get to open up your life for inspection just because they want to see what they can find. They have to name the person, state the reason, limit the search, face a judge, and justify themselves first.
The Fourth Amendment isn't like some giant general right as against the world. It is a right to be secure as against the government.
This is how a free society functions. Once you lose that principle, you don't just lose privacy, you lose one of the most important checks on power ever created. In our next video, I'm going to talk about the specific legal doctrine that is responsible for destroying the Fourth Amendment in the digital age. It's called the third-party doctrine, and I'll talk about the misguided history of how it emerged and why in the digital age it's become one of the most dangerous loopholes in American law. Ludlow Institute is a non-profit research and media institute that helps people reclaim their privacy in the digital world. If you'd like to support our work, visit ludlowinstitute.org/donate. And a huge thank you to everyone who already supports us. We can't make these videos without you. Your support keeps this channel free, and it helps more people get the tools and knowledge that they need.